consider using the liturgical calendar. The liturgical calendar. Oh, what is the liturgical calendar? Isn't that Catholic? No, it's biblical. Let me tell you why. Um, and I love this story. This comes from a guy who did a church plant in Turkey, and I think he's an Anglican now. But in those days, he was just kind of a good non-denom evangelical guy. He's still evangelical, of course. But I love what one of his MBB friends said to him. He's like, "Oh, before as a Muslim, we had this whole year, and we had the whole month of Ramadan and the Prophet's birthday and the feasts and like all these things that kind of sanctified time. That said time is not just a secular thing that's related to businesses and governments and budgets and whatever. Time is something where God actually has a design for, there's like a holy rhythm to the year." And he said, so I've left all of that and I've become a Christian, and you tell me that there's 2 days, there's Easter and Christmas? And surely if you're giving me something better with the Christian faith, surely there's got to be more. And I remember, I never forgot that story. So what does that look like to use a biblical framework for finding the holy rhythm for the year? Now, the original Christian calendar was seven days, right? Every Sunday was Easter, every Wednesday and every Friday was Good Friday. So the most ancient Christian calendar that we know was a weekly calendar, but then it obviously became a yearly calendar. So what are some other biblical events that we can think of that we could celebrate and observe throughout the year? And yes, they are observed in the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, and the Anglican and Lutheran churches too, by the way. So again, this is and many Presbyterian churches too. Yeah. So what are some of those things that happen in the Bible that where God is helping us to sanctify the rhythm of the year?
I was going to say Advent, but I don't know if Advent exactly is in the Bible, like December leading up to the 25th. But I don't know if you could actually find that in the Bible per se.
Well, Advent, so Advent is the beginning of the Christian year. The Christian year begins with Advent, and it's not something that's explicitly in the Bible, but what it is it's preparing for Christmas. Christmas begins on the 25th, and then it goes for 12 days after the 25th. I know Americans don't get this, but it's okay. So Advent is going up to that, and there are traditions. Now, it's not a biblical tradition, but it's a beautiful Germanic tradition of having the Advent candles. You have 4 of them, because the idea is you're preparing for the advent of Christ, the first advent of Christ, when Jesus is born as a little baby. But then you're also preparing for the second advent of Christ, when he will return to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end, in the words of the Creed, right? So it's a great time. And so Advent is a time of preparation. We're going to be reading passages from the Old Testament prophets talking about the coming of the Messiah. We're going to be reading some passages from Revelation, which I know the folks in the AG love Revelation. Is it as popular as I hear? I preach on Revelation, but from an Anglican point of view, so I don't get into any trouble with that. And we're looking at the ministry of John the Baptist, right? He's the forerunner, so profound biblical themes. And each of the candles signifies peace, faith, hope, love, and joy, to just form our character around these things. So all very biblical concepts. Good. And then you have the 12 days of Christmas. Christmas is when Jesus is born. And then 12 days after Christmas, you have Epiphany. Epiphany is when the wise men come to give the gifts. It's a big thing, Reyes Magos here in Spain. But theologically it's profound, because what do we celebrate at Epiphany? That Christ has come not only for the Jews, but for the whole world. Like, it is like the missionary feast of the year, Epiphany. It's beautiful. And then you have Ash Wednesday, which is 40 odd days before Easter. That's a time of preparation. It's a time of reflection, a time of repentance, a time of disciplining oneself and preparing to rise again from the grave with Christ. And then we have a feast. It comes from the Greek word for 50 days, Pentecost. And Pentecost is 50 days after Easter. We celebrate the church. We celebrate that we all belong to one body that exists throughout the centuries and throughout the continents and the world and every culture. And then one more would be the Annunciation. The Annunciation is when the angel comes to Mary and says, you're going to have this special role in God's plan for the world.
When is that?
Well, let's think about this.
Okay, yeah.
9 months before he's born.
Ah,
So March 25th. Yeah. The Bible doesn't say that it exactly happened 9 months, but that's where they went with that. That's a great time to celebrate motherhood, and it's a great time to celebrate and focus on what? The ministry of young people in the church. Yeah. So anyway, the point is we've got all of these biblical, beautiful resources, and we can use them to a lesser or greater extent to help our MBBs to understand that this sacred rhythm to time is not something that they've left behind when they embraced Christ. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do one more of these things, even though I've got 5 more topics here. And this is really the most important one. This is the most important one. This is your church is their new home. Your church is their new home. I've got an epigraph. An epigraph is one of those quotes that comes at the beginning of the book. I've got 2 epigraphs. I'll read the 2 epigraphs for you. This is a Bible one, so someone better tell me the citation or the source. Unto them will I give in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name better than of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. What is that? Not a very common passage. Any guess? Anyone want to guess the book? Isaiah. Okay, you've got Isaiah. Yeah, Isaiah 56:5, right? Why this one? Because I love this. This is kind of like the inspiration behind the book. Because what's going on in Isaiah, the last chapters, it's the audience is the group that has come back from Babylon or from the Persian Empire by that time, and they're resettling Jerusalem. And there's a number of people that were not like ethnically Jews that had believed in the God of Abraham and have gone back with them. And this is the time of Ezra, and he's kind of encouraging his sort of puritanical reforms, which he's successful with. And so then you have these kind of outsiders who have this faith, but they don't feel like they necessarily belong anymore. And I thought that in many ways is kind of how what happens with a lot of MBBs. They like, well, I have this faith, but I'll never really belong. And here, the Lord says, no, they will belong. And then my next epigraph, and this is from a guy named Temple Gardner. He was an Anglican missionary in Egypt, in Cairo, for many years, and very, very much a trailblazer. And he wrote this: whatever we may think of the Mohammedan religion, it has markedly stood for a brotherhood, a universal brotherhood of a sort. It may be that many of the manifestations of this brotherhood or community are imperfect, unspiritual, or injurious to those outside of it. But from the point of view of those within, it does stand for something. It stands for a lot. For some of them, it stands for everything. If this is so, it is obvious that unless we Christians can show them a brotherhood or a community that is higher, better, more spiritual, warmer, tenderer, and in one word, truer, they will marvel at how we have the face to preach to them at all. And contrariwise, a people so familiar with the idea of brotherhood will especially appreciate the real thing when they see it. So, and this is something I've seen all over the place, not just Turks or Persians or Arabs, but this idea that what you guys say about the church is nice, but I don't see you living it out. I don't see you living it out. And remember, when someone comes to Christ from a Muslim background, there is a good chance that they are saying goodbye to their family and their friends. They're making an enormous sacrifice. So we have to be able to provide them with something like Gardner says here, higher, better, more spiritual, warmer, tenderer, in one word, truer. We need to do that. It is not an easy thing because all of us already have friendships and relationships, and if we stopped going to church, we would still have our social network and our family. But for them, that has to become that Christian church, again, whether it's a big mega church or a little home group, that needs to become their new home. was talking with a colleague of mine, and I'll wrap up with this. Talking with a colleague of mine who was my mentor when we first arrived in the Middle East, a long time ago. And he's back in the States now, and he has an outreach in a large city in the South. And he was talking about a strategy that he has that when I heard it, I thought it was brilliant. He said, when we get a new believer, what I do is I have 7 people from the church. It doesn't matter if they're ministers or just people who attend or men or women. And I make sure that each of these people will call that new believer or meet with that new believer on every given day of the week to remind them that they're not alone, and so that they can get to know other Christians. Isn't that true, Dan, that's been such a challenge that we find people who are like, oh, I believe, and sometimes want to be baptized or have been baptized, and we're like, good. Well, let's incorporate you into this body, and it's a big challenge. It's, I think, one of the biggest ones that we found. Well, anyway, there's a couple of other ideas in the book, but in closing, I would just say that the idea really is to give them an everlasting name. That's the name of the book. It's I will give them an everlasting name, Pastoral Care for Christ Converts from Islam. But I will give them an everlasting name. You know, in the Semitic culture, Arabic as well as Jewish or Hebrew, to name something is to recognize its value, and also to in some way exercise some authority over it. So when Yahweh says, I will give them an everlasting name, even though these people were not of the blood of Israel, they are of the faith of Israel. I will give them a name that recognizes their value and their worth. So that's what I'm trying to do, trying to make a small contribution so that people working all around the world, and it's not clinical and it's not academic. I've got academic stuff if you want it. I've written a lot of that, but this is really just practical. And now we can go ahead and do Q&A. And I want to hear your thoughts on this material.